Hey, this is Chris Pandolfi from the Infamous Stringdusters, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who plays bluegrass.
My guest on Bluegrass Jam Along this week is Chris Pandolfi, who you will all know and love through the Infamous Stringdusters. But the reason I asked Chris on to the podcast today is because he is actually the host of my favourite podcast, which is called Inside the Musician's Brain. Chris, it's great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invite, Matt. And for that nice intro. My gosh, I really appreciate that.
It's such a cool podcast. I think something I've been getting more interested in over the past couple of years is just this. There's a lot of people out there thinking really deeply about music at the moment, about what it means to be a musician and how to sort of bring yourself as a human being to that. And so many of the things people talk about kind of overlap with just being a human being in the first place. And I listened to I think it's the last episode of your most recent season with Bryan Sutton. And you chatted at the beginning about what some of this stuff means to you and how you'd like to dig into some of it, maybe in a future episode. And I was just really curious to hear a bit more. And I think it all sort of stems out. There's a phrase that I think you might have used like right back at the beginning in the sort of trailer for the first season of the podcast. And the phrase that you used was creative minds are introspective minds. And that feels like a real sort of jumping off point for all of this.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think some creative minds are much more aware of the introspection factor, if that makes sense, and can potentially like talk about it and unpack it a little bit. And I think maybe also in turn analyze it for themselves and help, it really can help you understand your path to, say, deepening your relationship with music or deepening your relationship with life. And that's what I think, I hear you getting at, is that there are so many analogies between the two. And I know for me, my journey with music has helped me with my life and vice versa. And when I say help me with my life, I think I just mean to be a more content person, to get to the things that I'm trying to express most efficiently. Of course, I'm so lucky that I have this amazing forum with the Stringdusters, and it's really a once in a lifetime kind of opportunity, and I'm so grateful to have teamed up with those guys, and that gives me so much to work for and work toward. And then there's life, and we all live life, whether you're a musician or not. And I think there are people, spiritual thinkers who I have really learned a lot from, and we can dig into all of that. And I should say as a disclaimer, I'm no expert, and for me, it's a work in progress, like I think it is for everyone. And I think this phrase that can seem a little cliche, but is so incredibly true, is the journey is the thing. You never really end up in somewhere, and you're good, you're done. It doesn't really work like that. Even though we have these sort of terms floating out there, like, you might have a revelation, or you might feel some shade of enlightened. And that just means that you've learned something and you've acquired something new. And that can come from your own experience. Those things can be all pushed forward by listening to other people talk about their experiences. But ultimately, we go through and we see these things unfold for ourselves. And I know the journey of music and the journey of life have had so much interesting and also challenging and also uplifting, incredible overlap that I feel like that's something that I'm always kind of, observing. And that's where, getting back to your original point, that's the introspective mind. And what I said earlier, I really believe. I think musicians are introspective. Again, some of us have an easier time thinking about it and unpacking it, and maybe more of an awareness of it as it's going down. But we're all going through these fascinating and very unique journeys to try and get out what is inside of us. And, one day the music seems challenging, and maybe the next day life seems challenging, and you just kind of chip away at all of it and do the best you can, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And that word journey, I mean, and I think that were really interesting to me is obviously you interview people on your podcast and you interview them as a peer and as an equal, and you're all, you are maybe at a similar distance along that journey as they are. Whereas for me and a lot of the listeners, we're much earlier in our journeys. And it's easy to imagine, and people listening to this podcast will be sick of me saying this, but it's easy for us to imagine that you guys are at some destination where you've arrived and you've checked in and you're just lounging around the pool enjoying yourselves. And to hear every single person I've interviewed has described it as a journey and said, one of the first people I interviewed was Bryan Sutton. And he said, yeah, I'm on the same journey as you. I'm just a bit further down the road. And
I think that's true. And I think, you do have to lounge by the pool sometimes, and that's okay too. You don't have to it doesn't have to seem like this rigorous, unending thing. I think people will glean different concepts and in turn different lessons that they apply to what they're going through. Again, I think central to all of this is, we can listen and learn so much from our peers, whether people are ahead of us or it doesn't really matter. We really are all the same. And we can learn a lot from them, but ultimately we have to apply these lessons, these concepts to how life feels for us, because we all are having such a different experience. But wow, there is so much knowledge. Bryan is such a great example, and I loved interviewing him, and I've loved hanging out with him, and we've gotten to play some music, and you hear a guy like that play, and you're just blown away. The technical facility, the way he puts all the ideas together, and if he does a great job of explaining, I think, how he has arrived at that musical place, but he also is an incredibly deep thinker. And when you hear him talk about his journey, he, for example, is someone who is very articulate about what he's experiencing, and lucky us, because he's able to sort of extrapolate a lot of these concepts, and they're useful to everyone at every point in the journey. And I know, and one way to sort of illustrate that, and one thing that I've talked about a lot and that I really stand by, is this idea of the beginner's mind. And there's a great book called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and it's been a favorite of mine. I'm a big sports fan, and I get a lot from sports psychology and performance psychology, which has a lot of overlap with music. And Phil Jackson, the legendary NBA coach, he wrote a great book called Sacred Hoops, and he talks about how he gives a book to each player at the beginning of the season. He's managing egos and talent like you can't even imagine. Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, these guys who won 6 championships. And one of the books that he gives to his players is this book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And I was reading Sacred Hoops, and I thought, oh my God, I need to check that out. And I did. And it's transcriptions of talks that relate to this concept of, if we can envision ourselves as beginners, if we can embody that feeling, it really opens up a lot of doors. It allows us to be at a steeper place on the learning curve. It allows us to feel the joy that we often feel when we're at the beginning of something, whether it's a journey with music or anything that you love, a relationship or really anything. And when you're a beginner, you have this curiosity that is not burdened by ego or the need to feel like you're doing something well. And these concepts oftentimes get sort of paved over as we make the way down a path and we're making progress on a journey. And progress is great, but we don't want to lose that beginner's mind philosophy, because it really, again, makes a lot of things possible. And just like a lot of different ways to maybe improve, whatever it is that improve at whatever it is you're working on, this is just one of those things that we need to be mindful of. And sometimes, like, I keep a note card in my banjo case that has sort of the 3 or 4 things I want to be thinking about at that time. And beginner's mind will be on that list every now and then. And if I need a sort of refresher on this one of many concepts or tools that helps us to kind of just be present and be as deeply invested and committed to whatever it is that we're trying to do. And I love that one, the beginner's mind. And I think, the reason I bring it up is because, like you mentioned, Bryan Sutton, who, there's no one who's better at guitar than Bryan Sutton. There's other players who are in that same level, but he's just taken it so far and he makes such beautiful music. But he manages to embody the beginner's mind. And that's how he's learned, and applied so many of these concepts and gotten so far down the road, because, he doesn't envision himself this sort of expert who's socked in and you're good at this and you're not good at this. It's just like, hey, anything is possible, but you have to embody that feeling and that flow. And that's always just been one that really resonates with me, and one that sort of comes to mind with what you were talking about with guys like Bryan and being sort of at different levels.
We'll be right back with you just after this. Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins. If you're attending the NAMM show in January, stop by the Collings booth to say hello to the team, get hands-on with their selection of customised acoustics and electrics, and check out some exciting new prototypes they're working on for 2024. They'll also have a few of their world-class artists on hand demoing various instruments. And if you can't attend, don't forget to follow their Instagram and Facebook accounts throughout the show for photos, videos, and the latest news. Collings guitars are hand-built from the Sound Up in Austin, Texas. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. If one of your 2024 resolutions is to improve as a musician, Peghead Nation is the place to go. They have 65 streaming video courses for guitar, mandolin, banjo, fiddle, dobro, bass, and ukulele from some of the leading names in acoustic music. Courses cover bluegrass, old time, Irish music and swing, plus lessons dedicated to improvisation, theory and ear training. Your first course is just $20 a month, and you can add more for $10. Try any course free for a month with the promo code JAMALONG. Make 2024 a year of more music at pegheadnation.com.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because I take lessons from Bryan as part of the Artist Works thing. And as you say, he's incredibly eloquent at being able to explain stuff. But he's also pretty sort of frank with this. Like, we get a monthly video message from him, and there's all the video conversations with students he has, and he'll talk about the struggles he has and the things that he's finding hard, and, you know, going on the road with the Bale of Fleck tour at the moment. He talks openly about the things that, you know, he's struggling with. And it's,
Sure.
I think it's incredibly, it's sort of a big word to use, but that willingness to be vulnerable is really admirable. It'd be very easy for him to sit there with all the answers and just sort of dish them out one at a time to us. And he doesn't. He has a conversation and sort of encourages us and leads us. But it's an incredibly human way to teach.
And we have to realize that everybody has that. And for you, these things might feel easy in life. And you might look at a guy like Bryan Sutton and you say, oh, music's so easy for him. You know, it's not really the case. But life is not divided into these different experiences. You know, I think it's one experience. And I think that, again, there's just all this overlap. And if we look at a simple premise like being present, you know, and that can really be a valuable tool when we're making music. It can be a valuable tool when we're sitting around in the morning and starting our day. And if your mind is too caught up on reviewing the past or thinking forward to the future and not just, you know, right there with what's going on in the moment, well, you know, I think you really can strip yourself of how deep and content that experience can be. It can be very, very simple like that, you know, and the reality is that everybody has different phases of life that come easier and come harder to them. And it's one of these things you always need to keep in mind. And sometimes when we listen to, like, again, getting back to this idea that you might listen to somebody and think, oh, like that sounds so easy for them. But, you know, maybe the technical part of the music is easy, but finding, you know, that sort of balanced feeling in your life where you can really express yourself. Like, if you're a professional musician, people don't necessarily understand, like, it really takes a lot of energy to get up there in front of people and make your statement. You know, it's one thing to play music, but to perform is this whole other level of experience. It's this whole other skill. And I find it, you know, it really can tell you oftentimes, like, how dialed in, how content you are in the rest of your life. And sometimes it can be a release, you know, from things that are challenging you, but other times it can be a reflection of things that are challenging you. And you really, you know I've had periods like that where, you know, if things aren't as settled in my regular life, and that's how it is for everyone. And even the you know, the people who you most aspire to play like, they go through challenges with music, they go through challenges with their life, they experience the overlap between those two things. and it's always just a work in progress. And you have to remember, progress is never linear. And that's been a really hard one for me. And this is sort of what I was alluding to at the intro with that Bryan interview in episode 30 of my podcast is, I've had some big challenges recently with music, and I've really, tried to take some deliberate steps kind of back to take more steps forward. And it's a little bit of a leap of faith, and the progress is not linear. And then one day you're doing these things and you're playing music, and the experience is telling you you're not any good, or you're not as good as you were the day before or last year. And that can freak you out. I mean, for obvious reasons, we put all this time and energy into things and we want to get better at them, and we are getting better at them. But the perspective of how growth is not necessarily linear can get lost on us. And that's just your ego wanting to feel like it's in control. It has you ahead of where you were yesterday. And it's the most natural thing ever. And, it's important also to be able to kind of laugh at it and realize what's going on in real time. And it doesn't make you, worse at what you're trying to do than anyone else. And so it's the awareness of all these things in tandem that help us to kind of keep moving things forward, enjoy the experience while we're going, and, realize that growth is not linear, but ultimately we're trying to head net forward on our journey. And that's the goal, that's life.
And I think that's really interesting, because you're sort of talking about the sort of non-linear sound, and this maybe relates to life as much, maybe if more than music for me, but just that sense of having to relearn a lesson you've already learned. And I can't remember which book I read, but there's a book, I read so many sort of books on development and stuff. And I read one book and it said, there's far more value in rereading a book you got a lot out of than buying a new book. Like if something really was a light bulb moment for you, read it again. And it's just, it's the same, isn't it? We do forget the things we've learned on a regular basis. And
isn't it incredible?
Yeah, and it really puts me in mind of so that hearing your podcast sort of over the arc of 3 seasons or whatever it is, but particularly that Bryan Sutton episode, the words that come up again and again are journey, but also practice. And I don't just mean practice as in sitting with your instrument running through scales, but that thing of like any change, whether it's musical or in life, has to be a practice. You have to keep doing it. You can't just read something or understand something intellectually and it's there. You have to then go and do it. As you mentioned earlier, you have to then apply it.
Absolutely. And what you just said, oh my God, it's so true. It's like, how many times am I, sort of in the midst of something and thinking to myself, really, I have to learn this lesson again that I've been through 100 times. But this is where the personal experiential part of things comes in. And this is where that thing of like, when you learn something yourself, you figure out what it means to you. You didn't just read this line in a book and then you assimilated this information. You practiced it and you figured out what it meant for you. Well, there is a depth of that experience that allows you to own that concept in a much deeper way than, like I say, just like reading a line in the book. And you're like, hey, that resonates with me. Well, now you need to go practice it. Now you need to go learn how to apply it to what you do, and you have to work on it. A great example related to music is like people always ask, oh, well, how can I need to play faster, and it's like, well, to play faster, it's really important to be relaxed. And they say, okay, well, how do I do that? It's like, this concept, you need to be relaxed, but you need to practice it. And you need to devote really mindful time to, and this is something I've talked a lot about with Ron Block, who is a mentor to me, who was one of the guys who I had an early sort of aha moment, like you're talking about with Sutton, where, Ron was talking about working on these incredibly rudimentary things. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my goodness, if Ron Block needs to work on this, I'm certainly not above this. And I would feel that at times, like working on really simple things and feeling like, man, do the guys I look up to really have to do this? Well, guess what? They do. And they have, and they will more if they want to continue that journey. And whether you like it or not, sort of one of the most annoying things with music and talent is the most talented players, men, women, are also the ones who work the hardest, and that's probably because they work the smartest and they're getting a lot out of this work, and the journey is unfolding. And it's like, man, I just get chills even like talking about it. Like that's what life is all about, and this idea of practicing being relaxed, it's like people, they hear the concept, but they don't necessarily understand the practice part, the part of making it your own, the thing of putting the metronome at like 80 beats per minute and practicing like 2 fingers at a time and paying attention to every time you play a thumb attack, how much tension are you injecting into your index finger? And then slowing the metronome down even from there to a tempo where you can feel what you are doing and you can change the neurological pathway between your brain and your hand. Because if you just rely on muscle memory, which we ultimately do when we go to play, then you're going to revert to what you've done the most. Well, now here we are practicing a new thing and it's trying to assimilate this new skill. It's not enough that we've just heard that you need to be relaxed. We are going to that super slow tempo and retraining what our brain conceives is possible with our hand and what relaxation can be in there. Will we revert back in a live playing situation? Absolutely. Will we feel like we failed? Absolutely. Go through it over and over. And here's that thing of learning that lesson over and over. But this is where you are making it your own and you are building something that no one can take away from you. And it's just that I'm such a huge believer in, adversity is what teaches you the lessons, and adversity is what puts you through the ringer. And when someone else has given up, but you're not going to give up because you're going to keep going, well, that's when you build that thing that no one can take away from you. And that's the confidence. That's us realizing who we are. And it's such a big kind of gangly topic, but like you, I'm so fascinated with learning and I've been on a big learning journey myself. And so I'm getting a lot of practice. I'm getting a lot of times of having these lessons just be like, nope, not there yet. You're going to need to do this again. And that's all part of it. And you just have to embrace it.
And that sort of thing about tension, and again, life as well as music, but learning to relax at moments when your tendency is to tense up. And so many people I've heard talk about this idea of sort of noticing tension to start with, but then working to. And I think Chris Eldridge said a really interesting thing, and he said, "Yeah, if you want to get faster, you can put your metronome 2 BPM faster every day, and you'll get a bit quicker. That's great." He said, "Or you could put it 30 BPM faster than you stand any chance of playing a tune, and accept you're going to play it really, really, really badly, but just feel what it feels like to play relaxed at that speed. All the notes are wrong, the tone's wrong, it's awful, you're never going to play it in front of other people like that. But just sit for a minute and feel how your picking hand feels at 130 BPM if you're not worried about the notes." And that was a bit of a light bulb moment for me, because and then he sort of says, take it right back and slow it down and get the detail right. But just to sit there with my arm going at a speed that my left hand can't keep up with and going, well, if the notes don't matter, maybe I can relax, just feel for maybe 10 seconds what it feels like to be relaxed at that tempo. And it just sort of a little light went on. I went, oh, like it is possible for my body to be relaxed at that tempo. Now I need to go back and learn to actually play at that tempo. But it's just, that little confidence of going, okay, it's possible. Well,
and that process of observing yourself, that's a powerful thing. That's not something they teach you when you're a kid. It's just something, it's sort of a survival skill that our, the matrix that we've built and the societal experiment sort of requires, I think, ultimately, if you're gonna do something and you're gonna get good at something, and again, that could be life skills or music or any skills, you're gonna have to be real with yourself about where you're at. And that can be, a challenging process. And tension will tell you a lot, because tension is basically self-doubt lingering in your unconscious, and we all have it. And it's not a thing that you're ever going to rid yourself of completely. In fact, you're going to take on new elements of self-doubt as you grow older. And it's not something to be afraid of. It's a very natural thing. If there's a very easy explanation for it. And, ultimately we're just trying to survive, and we're these creatures, and there are things that will wash over us in ways that we will feel. Now, I will say one real meaningful sort of hack that I have really gotten into in these last few years is my breath, is using breathing. And, Bryan, I should have asked him. I sort of regretted not digging in a little deeper and asking him to give us some more specifics, although I have a feeling that he would have said something like this. Breathing, and I got really into breath work, and I read the James Nestor book, Breathe, and watched a bunch of talks online and did a whole podcast intro about it. I think it was in season 3. And it's just a known thing that if we breathe deeply and through our nose, and that's basically all you need to know. There's all different sort of counts you can do, in for 4, hold for 5, out for 7. I just think of it as breathe deeply in, hold it, and then expel, all the air that's in your lungs. If you do this, you are changing your physiology, and you're bringing your heart rate down. You're basically giving your body the sort of biofeedback that it would get in a relaxed state. So you're almost like tricking it into being relaxed is one way that you could think about it. Navy SEALs use this. Free divers use this. Anyone who, and I think, again, back to sports, and I love the sports analogies because I'm a big sports fan, and I just am fascinated by excellence in those realms. It's like so incredible. And professional golfers is a great example. You're on the 18th hole. You got a shot coming up that's going to cost you, hundreds of $1,000s if you miss it. You've worked your whole life for this. The pressure, think about that pressure, and it's this singular pursuit. Well, watch these guys breathe and watch them going in through the nose, out the mouth, holding their breath and controlling their physiology. And so, like, the stuff that Critter said, and Critter is incredible. One of my favorite guitar players, a close friend. And, we've definitely talked about this stuff. And there are things like that you can do that help you with the process of examining what's going on inside yourself, because that's going to be the first step to actually making changes to what's going on, or applying new feelings like that, tension free at a very fast tempo. But the breath work, starting about 30, 45 minutes before we go on, or even before a rehearsal, or if I'm not in the zone and I'm about to play, in with other people, whatever it is, I just start doing these breaths. And this is like my meditation practice. And I'm not someone who sits down and devotes 10 minutes to it every day. I don't do that. I do it throughout the day. Like, for example, I was on a run this morning, and I love running because it's a chance for me to really clear my mind. And if I notice that I'm thinking about things that are bothering me, whatever, I just start to breathe. And I just do big breath in through my nose, out through my mouth. And then it brings you up to the present moment, and you sort of are feeling like the vitality of your body. And then all of a sudden you're there, even if it's for a split second, unburdened by what's going on, because that breathing is just affecting what's going on in your body. So there's a lot to that. And that's definitely one tool that I think we all can use, again, in music, in life. I do it if I'm heading into an important meeting and I want to be focused. If I'm heading into a hang with some friends who I haven't seen in a long time and I really care about, I just want to be present for that, and really feel that and enjoy that, and not be tied to thinking about the past or the future. It is an amazing tool. And I just sort of will do it sporadically throughout the day, when I'm behind the wheel of the car, when I think about it, for 10 seconds, for 2 minutes. It doesn't matter, and for me, I love creating sort of in a, like, that habitual way, instead of being like, okay, every day at 1:00 I do this X, Y, Z. I like to try and sprinkle these things throughout the day so I can just use them whenever. Use them for a split second or for a few minutes. It doesn't matter. I just have access to what that can do for me. It's not a foolproof thing, but it's just, it's connecting me to a place that I know. The more practice I get with it, the more experience I get with it. And I know what it's doing to me. I know sort of what to expect. And it's been a huge help that way.
It's really interesting. So talking about being sort of present in a moment, because it's something that's talked about a lot these days. But just that range of examples you gave, it could be doing a gig, it could be seeing your friends, it could be anything. Like for me, just things on a daily basis, like, I don't know, taking the dog for a walk around the park and not being on my phone and not thinking about anything else, just enjoying the sunshine and taking the dog for a walk around the park. Or spending 10 minutes just mucking about with my son and not be thinking about other things. And I think that's one of the hardest challenges in a busy life, is to be present. But to be musical, and I don't mean just to sit and move your fingers around on a bit of wood, but to actually be musical and bring something of yourself to that, you have to be present. And I think that's one of the joys of particularly music like bluegrass that has a lot of improvisation to it, is you can't really be doing it if you're thinking about other stuff. You know, you have to just switch everything else off and be there.
You do. And if you want to be good at doing that, you have to practice it. And when I think of practicing music, I think of several phases. And again, this is sort of getting to some of that stuff that I was mentioning in the beginning of the Bryan episode, which basically is alluding to, I made a humongous technical change with my banjo playing about a year, within the last year and a half, and went from anchoring one finger on the head to anchoring two fingers on the head, because I felt like with one finger anchored, I was hitting the ceiling, and I wasn't willing to accept that that was sort of as far as I could go technically, or at least that I really felt the ceiling there. So I knew if I had used brute force, I could sort of inch it up, or maybe there was this other way. And it was a lot of sort of trial and error and intuition, and it's been a long road, but I can tell that it will yield huge benefits in the long run. But it put me in a zone where, after having played for 20 years, all of a sudden I was practicing like incredibly simple, rudimentary things, and it was humbling. And I had a lot of times on stage, and I still have been having times on stage, where I don't feel technically as unlimited as I want to. Well, I still can play music, and ironically, what it gives you an incredible practice in is, even in the face of feeling like technically challenged, we'll try to be present in that. Well, that's like extra challenging, because how can you be not aware of this thing that you sort of perceive as a hindrance, or as keeping you from being maybe better that you were at like a previous point in time? But you have that staring you in the face, and then you still ultimately need to be present. I mean, as a sort of extreme example, if you had one arm taped behind your back, but you had to be present, well, it's like, think about the challenge that would pose. So I've been getting sort of a lot of practice in both of these phases. And when I'm actually more specifically practicing music, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll devote a chunk of time to more technical things. And that's, again, metronome slow, paying attention to exactly where that tension is, stopping at the first sign of tension, shake it out, try and do just middle finger attacks with no tension. Okay, I start to get that going. Then I'm going to add in some of the other fingers, right? And then I'm reprogram. I consider that almost like reprogramming on a root level of how my brain, what happens with my body when I'm standing there with the banjo on, and I'm like, okay, it's time to play On My Way Back to the Old Home. Fingers go. It's like, well, what is your brain? How does that process go? What is your brain telling them? Well, I'm changing some of those root level messages, and that is. It's funny because when I tell students about that, I always sort of give them this disclaimer, this may seem really boring to you, but my life, I've devoted my life to seeing how far I can take the banjo. And, I've got these amazing opportunities, and I really, a lot of this is I really want to be the best I can be for my bandmates who really inspire me and push me, so you still got to have fun with the instrument, but I am sort of a glutton for punishment, and I love doing this stuff. And I love learning about, how our brain works and how they think neuroplasticity lasts so much deeper into life. And then just trying these processes for myself. Right. So there's this technical practice. Well, and then of course there's repertoire and learning new songs and things like that. They're going to be a little bit more functional. But then there's what I call phase 2 of practice. And in phase 2 of practice, you are practicing, entering, and remaining in the zone that you want to be in for a show. And if you do this well, it's essentially like a long meditation. You're just, if you do it well, some days you don't do it well. That's the whole reason that we're practicing it, right? And some shows it doesn't go that well. But the only way that you're going to get better, the only way that you're going to learn how this process unfolds for you is by practicing it. So I just will either play along with albums or play music, like make music, not like stop and start all the time. I have a list of tunes that sits on my desk in my studio, and I will just play. And what I'm working on in that time is not licks. It's not how to incorporate this new idea. It's not how to play this new tune. It's being as present and as focused on what I'm doing as I possibly can be. And the more hours that I log in that zone, the easier it will be to call up in a live playing situation. And it's all about the presence factor. And so, you kind of got these different things going, but ultimately when it's time to play music, it's like time to shut it all off and just make a statement. And how have you set yourself up for success? And that's the thing of practicing is practicing can be something that you do really well, and it can be something that reinforces bad habits too. And that's another thing that you need to figure out for yourself. But if you practice well and you are paying attention to what's going on with your brain and your body, and you're like deliberate about attacking the things that are hard for you, and then spending time in that meditative present zone, you're setting yourself up for success. So I preach that to people who take lessons with me. It's like practice smarter, not necessarily harder, and you will get a lot further down the road, I think, a lot quicker.
Truly, yeah. I interviewed a guy called Josh Turknett who wrote a book called The Laws of Banjo, and he's fascinating. And he was basically saying, look, if you practice 25 minutes a day, but you practice smart, he said, essentially, it's like going to the gym. You don't get fitter at the gym. You get fitter as your body processes what you did at the gym. And your brain builds these pathways after you practice, but you tell it what pathways to build when you practice. And he said something that, something I'm paraphrasing, but he said essentially most of us get so obsessed with the fact that we have limits that we get nowhere near to finding out what they actually are. Because we're also obsessed with, this idea that we're never going to get that good. We never find out how good we can get because we let it stop us. And if you just sit down and practice smart every day, even for 25 minutes, you will get better.
You definitely will. And I just read that book actually after Bryan mentioned it on my podcast, because he had Josh Turknett come speak at his Blue Ridge Guitar Academy. And I'm so excited to connect with him at some point because I'm such a nerd and I am really fascinated by these things. And, his whole theory of like talent is sort of the talent myth, that we can all work really hard on something. It really kind of opens up a whole other can of worms, which is, what is talent? Maybe talent is this thing that we sort of perceive as this kind of like mysterious thing that, this person's got talent. They were born with that. What did their parents do? But maybe talent is just, a quality that doesn't ever let you give up. Maybe part of talent that we don't reward or we don't necessarily talk about is more like persistence. And because again, remember, first of all, like I said earlier, Chris Thiele, Bela Fleck, not only these guys have the most to say and ideas, I think, that are in there, but they also work the hardest, And why do they work the hardest? Well, I think because their work pays off and they feel the gratification of good, solid practice and work in the process, right? But there is something inside of us, and I do agree. And, one thing I tell myself along the journey that for me really helps is because I've been way down on myself. And so I guarantee you has anyone who you see progress at anything. They've gone through periods of adversity, and you hear it so much. I mean, it's part of everyone. Find me someone who just had an easy path to getting great at something. Like, it doesn't exist, But one thing that I sort of tell myself along the way that can be, call it comforting or whatever, is like, I'm not going to give up. I no matter what happens, and I practiced banjo for like 2.5, 3 hours solid this morning, and I'm working on some recording stuff, and I'm getting this new technique, and it's unbelievably intoxicating. Like I feel like every day is a new, like, see where the ceiling is, and if I'm really warmed up and I've played a lot, wow, I can see, like, even though the muscle memory is not there, and it takes me still like longer to get warmed up for a show, longer to get in the zone, and there still are rolls that feel tight, and I've got to do some more of that kind of like root reprogramming around. But I know it works, and I know that there's nothing limiting me, holding me back, like there's no reason that someone else's hands can move faster than mine. And through all of this really, really hard work, I've sort of busting that myth, like the imposter syndrome, where I'm not as good as someone else, or going to see a show, and I'm just not going to give up. And I can tell myself that along the way, and that really helps me on a day that's hard and where I'm feeling like that progress is not linear. It's like, it's okay. Like I know, and I'll keep I keep a journal too, and I'm more sporadic about it now, but essentially it's just to help me remember when things went well. Because when things didn't go well, oftentimes those are the memories that really store. And those are the things that we call up first. And if you're not mindful about it, you got to kind of be careful of what your memory is telling you, and that ties into another really important part of this, which is you have to cultivate the joy in music. Practicing music cannot be this like eternally stressful experience. And I know, because I have been really guilty of this. And I know that through phases of my professional career, I've just become much too aware of what do people think about how I sound. And you know what? I did that. And you know what? So does everyone at some point. It's the awareness and how you react to it that will ultimately shape how these feelings, inform your journey and where you end up. You're not locked into anything. We are incredibly malleable in our impressions of ourselves and our impressions of how good we can be at something and what failure feels like, if we allow ourselves to be. And making sure that these journeys are not just these like rigorous, stress filled, oh, I've got shows next week. Like I really try to make sure that part of my practice each day, even though I'm going through a big sort of like, call it like a technical rebuild, I still make sure that I am practicing joyfully and playing music and playing along with a playlist on Spotify of music that I love, and maybe learning a new tune, and just like everything else, that's part of what you've got to cultivate. It's not just going to come automatically, but if we just stress ourselves out about all this crap, like we're not doing ourselves any good with that. So, there's one of those lessons I feel like I had to learn 10 zillion times before I actually got into a productive zone. Didn't necessarily feel like I was having success every day, but I trusted myself and I knew where I was heading, and I had fun with it along the way. So it's not just this rigorous, like a practice. And for a while I hated the word practice. Now I've come around to it, because I felt like I wanted to say, not like I practiced today. I wanted to say I played today, because what's the difference? Well, I've really come in these last few years to understand there is a difference, and that's okay. It's just a word, whatever. It's semantic, means something different to everyone else. But to me, practicing is that conscious working on how our brain connects with our hand and how the experience feels. And then playing is more of the cultivating the end game zone that we want to be in when we play. And that's just sort of how I've kind of come to look at those two things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does. One of the things that stuck with me most when I interviewed Bryan Sutton, and he was one of the very first interviews I did, but at the end of the episode, he said, one of my goals for myself when I step on stage is to try and notice joy. And
amen.
And it's that,
I love that.
I just read a book called 4,000 Weeks, which has nothing to do with music, but it's about life. And it makes an incredibly strong point that we tend to defer our happiness to unspecified times in the future, that we don't know if they're ever going to arrive or not. And then I guess the musical equivalent of that is going, I will be happy when I can play Cherokee Shuffle at 130 BPM, or I will be happy when I win the IBMA award, or I will be happy when whatever. And to the point you were just making then, you have to find those bits of joy every day, because you can't guarantee they're coming at some point down the road. You have to find them now, because they may come down the road, but if you can build them into your daily experience, you're there.
And it's nothing more than mindfulness and practice. It's nothing more than awareness and repetitions. That's another way to think of practice. It's just like like you say, like the going to the gym analogy. It's just like repetitions. You go to the gym and you do the same stuff every day, but it's a different thing than it was the day before, because you're in a different starting place and your understanding of the journey is different. It's just like repetitions. Well, we forget to apply that principle to things that, I think joy is a great example, things that maybe we take for granted because they are so accessible to us, again, when we are at that beginning stage of things. And when you've just taken up an instrument, you're nowhere near crafting a concept of yourself as a professional musician. You're nowhere near all that awareness that comes around, I need to sound good tonight, or, I'm playing on the Grand Ole Opry, or Bela Fleck is sitting in the front row. It could be like one of a million things. Like, you're not near any of that. Joy is what the experience is. We don't know. That's all it is. It's discovery. It's joy. It's this thing that I'm figuring out for myself. I mean, that's just the best. That's life. That's like what life is all about, But then if we take that and we go 20 years down the road, 40 years down the road, whatever, like the experience changes. So we need to become more mindful about noticing, practicing, again, getting repetitions in the noticing of joy and the allowing of joy, the allowing of ourselves to be just grateful, the allowing of allow yourself to just stop judging for a moment and realize, I had a great one of these this past weekend. We Andy Hall from the Stringdusters and I do this thing called Bluegrass Generals, and we bring together great pickers from all the bands in our world. And we did one at a little festival in Southern Colorado, and Ronnie McCurry was on mandolin, and Alan Bartram from the Traveling McCurrys was on bass, and then Bill Nershi from String Cheese Incident on guitar. And, we're halfway through this gig, and I just had one of those great moments, and I was sort of like proud of myself in the moment, because it just came up, and I'm thinking to myself, man, and this is sort of how the dialogue will go in my head specifically, if like 18-year-old me could see this going on, and because I freaking worshipped the Del McCurry band and String Cheese Incident, but I've worked really, really hard to put myself in that position. And then you're in that nice zone where you're allowing yourself to like realize how cool this is. It doesn't matter, like how good you did at it. It's just like you're here in this moment with these people, and when that starts to happen sort of unconsciously, I mean, you need to cultivate it. You need to observe it. And it's this thing that is incredibly accessible when we start something. But as we get much deeper into the journey, it can be a little bit more elusive unless you are mindful, and then it can be like even more abundant because you've devoted your life to this thing. How beautiful is that? You've devoted your life to really seeing how deep you can, how deep your relationship with an instrument can go, and then transmitting all this joy to the people in the audience. Like, that's a very special thing, and if you can be aware of that and see that all the work that you've done, no, it hasn't landed you in this place where joy is less abundant because, you have to grapple with all the sort of responsibilities and the ego factor. And no, you've set yourself up for this beautiful opportunity that people would kill for, and it's our job as, I think, conscientious humans to try and, if you don't cultivate that joy, well, guess what? It's not going to help you do your job any better. And what are you transmitting to those people? Because let me tell you, they can't tell whether your roll is like perfectly in time. They can't tell whether you nailed that lick that you practiced so hard last week. But can they tell whether you're present with them in that moment? Can they tell whether you're grateful, whether you're joyous? That's the stuff that they can tune into. So again, just one more piece of the puzzle that we really need to cultivate, be mindful of, and practice as we go along and just get repetitions in the art of noticing joy. And then just like everything else, it will become muscle memory. It will become more kind of automatic.
It's really interesting, just sort of like thinking about that as you said it and realizing that actually this podcast, that is what that is for me. Like once a week, once every couple of weeks, I get to turn my phone off, sit in a room and talk to somebody interesting about something I'm interested in. And like so many people say yes to an interview and I get to sit and have a conversation like this for an hour, which is such a joy and such a lucky position to be in. And
it's the best.
And if I spend all my time thinking about how I'm going to monetize the podcast or how I should market it or grow downloads, like it's just, there's no joy in that. But if I just send emails to people saying, I'd really like to talk to you for an hour, can I? And they say yes, and I do. All the rest of it sort of comes out of that anyway. If I find a conversation interesting and engage with somebody and ask the questions, then people listening are going to find it interesting. And I can, I'm lucky enough that I have a day job that funds this. So I don't have to worry too much about making money, and I could just do it. And it's, all the good stuff just comes.
Absolutely my favorite part of being a podcast host. And I have just loved Inside the Musician's Brain. It's been such an awesome journey. And I mean, don't tell my guests, don't tell anyone, but I just look at it like, are you kidding? I get to just sit here and ask, Bryan Sutton, Bela Fleck, Madison Cunningham. I just get to ask these people like in a very focused, pointed way, what are the challenges for them? That's like the most valuable, incredible information you could ever happen upon as a human, as an artist, as anything. And there's so many lessons that you can extrapolate out. And again, there's so many themes that sort of are keep recurring, but you're hearing them through the eyes of these different people. So you're not just hearing the same thing over and over. You're hearing like there's this very consistent thematic thing, but then they're talking about how it's applied to their experience with music, to their experience with life, to their experience as a human being. And that is just the incredible, beautiful part about it. And I really echo what you said a moment ago. I've learned, I remember when I started doing interviews, I get kind of like nervous and I just wanted to be good. I wanted to get a lot out of this and I do a lot of preparation and I'd have things prepared. And then ultimately I realized, the best way for me to prepare, if it's someone who I'm not as familiar with, I of course will, do my homework and make sure I know what's what. But the best thing that I can do is listen to a lot of their music, which really I feel like deepens my connection with who they are as an artist and helps me to speak intelligently about what I perceive in their craft and ask them meaningful questions. That's part of it. But even more important than that is just when it's time to hit record, I am as focused and just like if you can be as present as you possibly can and just listen to every word. And that is such an awesome exercise. We are so lucky to have that be the thing that we're trying to be good at because, part of, I think the human experience and part of what I really get out of like some of the spiritual, talks that I listen to and I love, Ram Dass and I've listened to a good bit of like Adyashanti and, a couple of the guys in my band, Andy Hall and Travis and I have definitely spoken about these things a good bit. And it's this idea of presence. And in addition to that, I love this concept so much. If we can focus on something other than ourselves, we're just going to be happier. If you can take that just self sort of analyzing thing that runs in the background by nature, like you can't feel bad about it. It's part of who we are and what we are. But if we can very intentionally take the focus off of ourselves and just think and be deeply invested in what someone else is saying, someone else's experience, how someone else feels the world. Wow, that is a gift. And that's something that I feel like I've gotten better at and just become like more aware of through my time as a podcast host, because that's what the experience has evolved into for me is this beautiful, hour and a half of just getting focused on someone else's experience. And it's just like, oh, it's so kind of refreshing. I mean, does that resonate with you? Do you know, I mean, it sounds like you know what I'm talking about.
Totally. And all sorts of different scenarios. I did a thing last year through work where I was part of a charity project called the Growth Project, and they pair up people from businesses and people who work in charities with the idea that the charities benefit from some sort of process and structure and experience from businesses, but the businesses really benefit from talking to people who are very connected to the purpose of what they do. And just some of the conversations with people, just hearing how people approach stuff in there, whether they're charities or businesses, but just hearing how people approach stuff and how actually who they are as humans affects that. It's just endlessly fascinating. So it just made me think of a thing you were sort of talking before about not focusing on ourselves. It reminded me, a friend of mine said recently, said his favourite people to hang around with are people who have something in their life they take incredibly seriously, but they don't take themselves at all seriously. And that's it. And again, you have to kind of be gentle on yourself, because it's a hard thing to do. But if that's what you, again, are getting practice in or getting reps in, and that's kind of how I try to describe sort of like where I'm at with music, is really working hard. I mean, I'm having the deepest practice sessions, and they're sometimes really frustrating. And then just playing some music and enjoying it and realizing, like, and Chris Eldridge told a great story about Live From Here on my podcast, where it was Jim Hall's birthday, and they were going to do some tribute, some crazy intricate jazz guitar thing. He worked on it all night. They get to the broadcast, he gets halfway through, and he just stops. And I mean, now it's taped, so he can go back and play it again. But I mean, you're not supposed to go back and play it again. And you're also, you're supposed to be able to play it. Like you're here in Feely's crew and whatever. And he just talks about how he woke up the next day and realized, life goes on. Nothing has really changed because of that. We've worked so hard to get to where we are. We've got to trust and rely on what we're doing. So even though the self-judgment meter can run out of control on a given day or in a given situation, just resting on this idea that, we've taken it really seriously and we've worked hard on this, and we can just, you can count on that, but then taking the pressure off things. And I agree. I love hanging out with people who, I'm just really fascinated by people who have devoted their lives to something, anything. And I love learning from people, and I love listening to people who are passionate about things talk and just comparing notes on all this. I mean, that's that again, I love people, and I'm just fascinated by all these varying experiences, all the overlap. There's so much to learn from all of these other experiences. And that's just been, like I say, one of the really cool things about doing the podcast host game is, of course I want to share some of my experiences too, but I do an intro to every episode, and that's a piece that I really love and think about a lot. And I'm always thinking about what I want to talk about in those intros. And I just keep these sort of worksheets, like on Google Docs, and I'll go in there and I'll add an idea, and I'll be driving one day, and I'll be just driving, and I'll just be breathing through my nose and doing my breath thing. And it's just like kind of, and it's amazing what great ideas. Hey, there's something I want to share with the world, or hey, there's something that I am really interested in, but I'm certainly no expert on. But, I know that at least investigating it has really opened up a lot of interesting sort of concepts or dialogues within myself. This is something I want to share with people, and I love the feedback that I've gotten from that. And wow, what an awesome gift to have, when I'm in season with my podcast every other week, I get 10 minutes to just talk to people and share some things that maybe help, or maybe they just skip right to the interview. I don't care. It's like, that's my thing. And that's an outlet that I love. And it's something that differentiates me, from my peers, because bluegrass obviously is this incredibly virtuosic music world, and people are so incredible, and I love all of that. But, I'm also just honestly kind of a nerd, and I love to,
read sci-fi books, and I love to chat with people about, neuroplasticity or whatever, nerd out about these things. I'm no expert, but I'm fascinated. And to me, that's just like such a big part of life. And so that's kind of, again, the podcast intros is where I get to kind of get into some of that stuff and throw it out there. And it's cool. I think, I have had a lot of experience. I have a lot of experience left to go, but I've been really lucky to do some awesome things. And I feel like sharing a lot of that with the world, that's just been a really, really cool part of it.
And it's interesting sort of hearing you talk about sort of taking notes for future episodes. I mean, if I interview somebody and they talk about or listen to your podcast, Chris Eldridge might mention Julian Lage or Jerry Douglas or somebody. I may never interview either of those people, but I've got sheets of notes of things that have occurred to me about their music at some point. And if I ever do get the chance, I've got a bunch of things I want to ask them. And it's just that thing of constantly having that dialogue in your head and thinking about things and making connections. And it's a bit like a little world you can carry around in your head at all times and just sort of dip into and think about. And I find it fascinating. It's endlessly interesting. But it reminded me you talk. No, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, I couldn't stop that even if I wanted to, even if I had a podcast or not, that dialogue would be going, and, my brain would just it's funny because I think of, sort of like I say, like a lot of with what I've been experienced, what I have experienced and have been experiencing with music in recent years is like, sometimes I ask myself like, whoa, is this just like a really big, like, self-imposed challenge because you felt like you were like bored and didn't have enough challenging? Like, are you crazy? And of course it's not. And I'm actually very deliberate about why I've, done some of these things. And I think I will always take that approach to life. And I don't mind a challenge, and I think, again, the challenge and the getting knocked down, like if you really go into the face of that, well, then you're getting this like dual lesson in how you react to adversity, but being observant, because that's really what you're talking about is this ability to tune into other people's experiences, to external input, because we all have a whole world contained in our head, I have an experience sometimes, and it's sort of a recurring thing where I'll like pull up to a stoplight and I'll look over in the car next to me and it's just some stranger, a person I've never seen before. And I just have this moment of like, and maybe I've been driving thinking about something that I'm, working on, or a dynamic in my life, or just like any of the normal stuff that we think about. And it's like this rich, it's so deep, it's my life. And it's like, it's just, I'm living it in that moment. And it's life at that moment. And I pull up next to someone and I look over and there's this other person and they've got this whole universe unfolding in their head. And then you realize there's 10 cars behind you and each of those cars has, and it's like, oh my goodness, wow. Like that is a lot of energy. And on the flip side of that, we're all just these little points of consciousness, sort of wandering around, like doing our best, who's going to remember you or me, well, some people, but ultimately like it doesn't really matter what we do in the end. Like you can do anything with your life, and we all have different goals, but we have so much going on within, like so much. If we let it go, the monologue could just take up 100% of your bandwidth. But if you do a good job, and again, one of the things I've just loved about being a podcast host of building that muscle of tuning into what else is out there, whether it's other people's experiences or nature or what you perceive, on a given day when you go out into the world, these different energies and the dynamics of life and all these. Wow, there is so much there, not only the input that you can take on, but just the simple exercise of getting out of your immediate head and voice. And that's kind of what you're talking about. And I think so, that observation is like such an important step. And we're lucky to be able to do that because, some people are born into such adverse circumstances in their life that survival takes up a huge piece of the pie. And I try to always be as grateful as I can that I'm in a position, though my life has challenges like everyone's does. You know, for the most part, I get to sit above some of that really challenging stuff, and I'm lucky, you know, and I get to be a musician. I get to travel and play music. So that's a pretty gifted scenario. And that's sort of my way of not taking it for granted, is like, I really want to pay attention to what's out there and try and help other people out and, you know, listen and observe and do as much sort of good to that end as I possibly can. And being observant is like the first step that opens the door to all of that, I think.
Yeah, and there's something fascinating in amongst all of that. It made me think of just so many of the conversations I've had with musicians about being true to you. So I had a conversation with Critter about them covering the Church Street Blues album and other people's perceptions of stuff. And essentially that your job as a musician is to be you. It's not to be anybody else. It's just to be you. And it sort of makes me mindful of, I think for me, a big turning point in everything was becoming a dad. My son's about to turn 10. And before he was born, I sat down and my wife sort of chatting about how we wanted to bring him up. And we said, well, we just want a kid that's confident to be himself, but doesn't like to, and it sort of, it comes forward into essentially your job as a musician. But I think probably all of us, our job as human beings, there is a unique us-shaped space in the universe that nobody else can fill because nobody else is us. Mm-hmm. And our job is to find that space and as fully occupy it as we can without treading on anybody else's space to get there. And if you can do that as a human, but also as a musician, like you take your range of influences and you add whatever comes from you, nobody else is ever going to be that. And that's sort of our job, is to keep looking for that in ourselves as humans and musicians and friends and parents and whatever else we do, but to be as much us as we possibly can without standing on anybody else.
Absolutely. And though I do not have children, I have heard from many people like yourself who have that experience can be sort of foundational in all of these things that we're talking about. And I think a lot of that is because all of a sudden life, which until that moment was just really 90+% about you, and then, you know, maybe, you know, you have your family, but like, think about what a day in the life of a human, you're thinking about yourself, you're managing your own thoughts and goal. It's like really primarily about you. And then when you have a child, that's a sort of foundational shift to that end, you know, and you can't simulate that experience any other way, really. And you hear the same thing. I was actually just talking with a close friend this past weekend about something that I've been really fascinated by. And that's sometimes when you hear interviews with people who have, like, for example, just gotten like a terminal cancer diagnosis, or some thing has happened that all of a sudden their mortality is not a given anymore. And the end of life maybe even is potentially coming very soon. Like, could you imagine what that would do for your perspective on so many things in your life? The answer is no, you can't imagine. And it's the same, you know, and there are many different shades of this experience. You know, I think that there's actually some overlap with like all this talk about people using psychedelics in recent years, and the great Michael Pollan book, How to Change Your Mind. And, you know, there's lots of other books that, you know, he sort of approaches the topic from a beginning standpoint. There's another one called Sacred Knowledge that I just love. That's like written by someone who is an expert in these things and has devoted their life to journeying in those realms. And when people are realizing that when you take, for example, you know, in a very intentional way, something that like turns a key in your brain, you know, and I've definitely done some of this myself, and it's been incredibly beneficial as one more piece to the whole experience. And it's like meditation, which, do you meditate at all on any sort of regular basis? Just curious.
No, I've sort of tried, and I find that it's a bit like the morning routine. Like if I start my day mindfully in some form and with some form of intent, whether it's some exercise or playing some music or reading or doing some, but I find it very hard to establish that as a daily thing. But I try and find moments through the day, like you were saying earlier, really.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of people do. You know why? Because meditating is really hard. And getting to, I think, what we think meditation is supposed to be is really hard. And if you sit down for 10 minutes and you have your mantra and you focus on your breath, we all know sort of meditation 101, and the thoughts come in and you're just sort of supposed to sort of observe. But like that real moment of clarity, like if you get a split second of that, it's very palpable and like awesome. Now, I'm like you, and I've tried to sort of transition that practice into something that's more of an everyday thing, something that I can do at any moment. I can do it for a couple seconds. I can do it for a couple minutes. And it's just like, I think that's my way of it's not this like important thing that you have to set aside time for. It's just a little reboot throughout the day to try and get you sort of back to center, right? Well, a lot of, I think the best way that I could describe, some of what people are getting out of these experiences, whether it's LSD or psilocybin, MDMA, there's different, things, for different folks who are looking for different experiences, but it's kind of just like a really long meditation. Like you have just turned the key to step into that space for a potentially prolonged period of time where that sense of ego, that sense of self drops away. And wow, like there's a lot of value in that. If we can, and it's not for everyone and it doesn't work perfectly every time. And I think it takes some experience to get up to speed with it. But there's, a body of knowledge now so big and so irrefutable that you can't deny that these things, they open a door to places in our brain and our soul that we don't normally have access to. But we are these incredible, we are each capable of basically like boundless consciousness, presence, the feeling of connection to everything else and everyone else that's in our world. At any moment, any second of the day, this is there. It doesn't go away and then it's back at the time when you want to meditate. No, it's always there. It's just a question of how strongly have we built the pathway to get in there and experience it. And it's the same as phase 2 of practicing music, a meditation. It's building that zone, that pathway. It's trying to push that door a little bit more open every time, and repetitions, practice, and there's just a lot of great knowledge and understanding in all of those things, meditation too. And I mean, for someone that could be like their daily run, like I was saying, when I go running or when I'm on a long drive, those are prime times for me to just sort of like center myself and kind of see what's there, see if I can look a little further into that space, if I can find that content zone and then see what comes up, or just experience it, just be there, and then watch how that experience informs the rest of your life. Because you know what? You need to go to the store. You need to answer your emails. You need to, like, the point of a spiritual practice is not to like all of a sudden go sit in the woods and not do anything. Like life is still life. And I love some of those more functional approaches to it where it's like, I'm going to see how much I can be in that zone, how much I can really let that, that's where I'm like really feel like me and centered and less of the ego and the judgment. And then see how that experience can bleed out into and help me with kind of the rest of my life. You know what I mean? Because it's not all going to suddenly be this like sheen of enlightenment and everything. I love listening to like when you hear like Eckhart Tolle talk about, he'll be at a talk and someone will ask him like, oh, like, what did you do this morning? And he'll be like, went, got a cup of coffee, sat there, like nothing. Like if you can find the immense beauty in those moments, the absolute boundless connection that we can feel to everything else, if you can just get like the most fleeting glimpse of that, to me, those are some of the most rich, experiences that we can have in life. And they only come through awareness and practice.
They used the word talking about all that. Use the word connection, and I think that's one of the hardest things is in a busy life in the modern world, and also there's whole conversations we had about how we've been conditioned over the past half a century, but we have this sort of weird sense that the individual is a thing to be prized, and that we're all self-made, unique, independent individual. And actually, connection with other people is for me, it's become one of the most important things. And when I get stressed and when I find life tricky, the thing I shut off is connection with other people sometimes. And I'm learning to not do that and lean into it at those times. It's a bit like going back to talking about tension earlier and learning to let go of it. And it's that thing of, it is all connected. I had a conversation with my 9-year-old son the other day and said, part of your left knee maybe was once Beethoven, or maybe it was once a dinosaur, like all the bits of the world that exist. They're all floating around, and a bit of you one day will be a bit of a bridge or a bit of a teacup, or it's all just like we're all connected to all of it. One day you might be a lamppost. And it is.
I think that's very true. Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think really, this is where the term empathy comes in. And we hear this term thrown around a lot, and we hear it thrown around as, like, for example, like a goal, like, if you can get to where you're feeling, more empathy. Well, and of course the inverse is true. And, I've experienced some people in my life who, and everyone's different and we all walk our own path. But a lot of times, realistically, people who you experience who are like harder to deal with and not as content and are not as balanced in their life and are probably not charging as hard at some external goal that maybe like makes other people happy, whatever. They're consumed with themselves. And that's, for a lot of people, that's like their lot in life. And you see it. And boy, I just try to, in those moments, just be grateful for the way that I'm wired, because I think that a lot of this is maybe more nature than nurture. And it's the ability to feel just like solid in yourself. And what you said about raising your son, I love that. And I really admire that. Like, if you really can set someone else up for success, if you can just give them the confidence to realize that, like, they're okay and they're doing things in life that they think are important, and they shouldn't question themselves, because it's that endless loop of questioning yourself that takes away the empathy. It takes away your connection with other people. Again, this thing I mentioned earlier, you just, sometimes if you want to feel better, a great thing to do is just stop thinking about yourself. Just put that attention on someone else. It sounds so simple, but it's very, very hard for certain people. And for other people, it's easier, and if you have some predisposition to be able to do that, again, it's something that's probably worth practicing and getting more reps in on, because it's a muscle that can be built. And you think about how slow the growth is from like repetitions, like the gym is a great analogy. You don't go back to the gym the next day. You look exactly the same as you did the day before. And you go back the next day and you look exactly the same as you did before. But you look at a 3-month before and after, and there's a major change. And that is like the best lesson in perspective that we could possibly get. You may not feel like these things are making a big difference all in one shot or in one day or in one practice session, but it's being mindful, it's being aware of things. And the empathy is just, it's the proven time and time again that the more connected we can feel to everything else, the happier we are, and we could really, the world is a crazy place right now. And, I know that's certainly one thing I end up feeling a lot about, over here in the States is like, man, if people could really just get a lesson in empathy and really start caring about what others think, well, you know what? We'd have to make a small sacrifice for ourselves. But what we'd get back, we wouldn't even know that kind of abundance. But that's just not what we are trained to do. It's what it's come up a few times, all this sort of societal program. Everything tells us that we need to strive for this individual achievement. And here in the United States, wow, the sense of individualism and entitlement, I think, is a big part of a big part of what's gotten us to this weird place that we're at, where it's like everyone is just sort of at war with each other. It's like, really? I don't think that's going to do us any good. But conditioning is a very powerful thing. And all of what we're talking about today is trying to be intentional about our own course of conditioning, of learning, of understanding ourselves, of growing in a lot of instances out of the things that we've been taught and conditioned since we were youngsters. Now, that doesn't mean that everything that you learn is like something that you have to undo. In fact, I think if you were lucky to be raised by caring, conscientious parents, well, that again is the thing that kind of sets you up for success. But a lot of what society shows us and dictates, we really got to be careful about that and be as conscientious, as conscious as we can be of how we're taking things on and how we're treating other people. And it's a perspective thing. It might not be right on the surface obvious in all these situations, but the more focused that we can, the more of a focused environment that we create, hey, this is what I want to be, once we sort of become conscientious adults, well, then away you go with your practice and you sort of see where it takes you.
And I think that's sort of circling back to where we started, really, but I think that's one of the reasons that I love your podcast is that it gets into some of that stuff, and it's not afraid to stretch the lines between what makes you a good banjo player and what makes you a good human being. It's like all of it really is just about intent, deciding where you want to go, and then practicing. And whether you want to be wherever you want to be, decide where you want to go, and then get there a little bit every day.
Absolutely. And also just giving fans a glimpse at the reality that, hey, you know what? Your favorite artists, they do the same crap that you do. They face the same challenges that you do. And I know as a fan, that's really deepened my relationship with the artists that I love, is learning more about them and hearing them speak passionately about the things that are challenging for them. So, my goal is to pull back the curtain a little bit and let, and not only, of course, we learn all this amazing stuff from people who've had all these rich life experiences and how to overcome adversity and all these amazing things. But in addition to that, giving fans the opportunity to see and hear from their favorite artists about what they've been through, I just think that's such an awesome. I mean, I've listened, I've gone back after podcast interviews that I've done, and I've heard their music in a whole different way. Seriously. Like I listen to it and it moves me more. I care about it more. I listen more deeply. And then surprise, surprise, there I am entering that zone where I'm like really paying attention to something that's not myself. And we've all been there listening to music and the judgment meter is running. And I'm like listening to a banjo player and I'm just like, oh, they're better than me. Life is over. And it happens. Like we think stuff like that. It's crazy. But if you can just listen and say, oh, that is beautiful. And what are they trying to say there? And listen to that expression. And on just for a split second, I'm just in someone else's world. Like that is the coolest thing ever. That is when the music has come to life. That's when you're experiencing some real deep empathy, and all of that just kind of spits you out the other side. And for me, in a place where I'm better suited, more balanced, and just in a better place to kind of take on everything that life throws at me.
And I love the story you told before about Chris Eldridge sort of stopping a song halfway through, and because sometimes it's not the big deep conversations that show you this stuff. It's the little bits and pieces of life that are just, and you sort of said being part of Chris Thiele's gang, you have to be at time. And I saw Punch Brothers years ago, and they started a song, quite a intense song, and Thiele stopped them about a minute in, and the whole room went quiet. What's he doing? And he went, sorry, got my tongue stuck in my braces and I was about to start singing. And just that time, and this is, like we have this thing about Chris Thiele being sort of the loftiest of the loftiest, and he's just a guy who has worked incredibly hard but can still get his tongue stuck in his braces, and he laughed about it. Like, he wasn't embarrassed. He was like, got my tongue stuck. Let's start that one again. And sometimes it's the tiny stuff.
I remember, I'll never forget, as long as I live, I was on stage, it was like before the Stringdusters. I was at the Gray Fox Bluegrass Festival, and I was playing with a band called the New England Bluegrass Band. And I was on stage, and we played a show. And after the show, I was walking around, and I bumped into one of my heroes, Danny Barnes. And I'd never met Danny Barnes before, and I'd never met any. I mean, I was not a part of the scene, anything like I am now. And I was just, lived in New England and was playing with this local band. And I ran into Danny Barnes, and he stopped me, and he said, "Hey, you guys sounded great." And he said, "You know what I loved?" He said, "I saw you make a mistake and stop playing, and I saw you laugh about it." And he said, "That is real music to me." And, I don't know if I understood or internalized what he meant, like, for years after that. But I think about that sometimes, and I think, wow, if I could, whatever, some hypothetical situation, like if I could pay for that energy that I felt on stage where I just made a mistake and laughed about it, like, oh my goodness, what value there is in that, and that's confidence. That's being comfortable with yourself. That's realizing that there is like nothing really on the line. And it demonstrates that can be very abundant early on when we take something on, because I'd probably been playing banjo for like 5 years or something. And then it can be something that becomes more elusive and that we have to cultivate as we go along. Again, just like mindfulness, being aware of things, observing things, practicing, getting repetitions in them. But it happens to all of us, and the ability to be confident enough and curious enough and realize that things are not that important to just laugh about it. Like it seems, at the time, I don't think I thought anything of that. That wasn't a small success or wasn't anything. It was just like that part of being free and present with music just comes so naturally when you're sort of in that headspace. But you work your whole life and you craft something that you really care about and that you're confident in, and you're on stage with Punch Brothers and your tongue gets stuck in your braces. You know what? You can stop the song, and that's cool. I mean, just knowing that there's just not so much on the line. And, to go back to like another sort of sports analogy, they say, well, to be good at something, again, like golf, I think presents a lot of interesting analogies because it's such a solitary endeavor with such fine motor skills, like a micron in the wrong direction and your golf ball flies off into the weeds and, you lose the tournament or whatever. But it's like that pressure, managing that pressure. And you hear them sometimes say, well, how do you be good at something? You have to not care about it. Well, how do you not care about something that you've put all this time and energy into? It's like, that's one of the elusive ones. That's one of the ones where if you can log time in that zone where the ego dissolves and realize this is all just, everyone's just out there trying to do their best in life. Even Chris Thiele, when the show is done, he goes back to a quiet place and it's just him and his thoughts, and life is an experience much bigger than how someone perceives how you did at something. In fact, it doesn't really matter, and it's not going to do you any good. So, it's like this lifelong journey of sort of taking the pressure off of that, and how do you arrive at that place? And it's easy one day, it's impossible the next, but it's fascinating all the way along. And that's, that's one of my favorite things about being a professional musician, is just the ability to really spend my life working on this incredible puzzle of music and technique and influences and the mental game and performing. And it's like, it's a real pain in the ass someday, but I wouldn't trade it for anything.
And I think that's a beautiful place to sort of leave it. That sums up so many of the things we've talked about over the past, what must be almost an hour and a half now. And I've had so many more questions about your Bluegrass Manifesto, and we may have to do another one at some point to get to that. But
man, I'm game. Anytime, man. I've really, really enjoyed this.
It's been a real treat. Thanks for doing it.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Thank you.
Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins, making some of the finest guitars and mandolins in the world since the 1970s. Visit collingsguitars.com and find out why.